Hello and welcome to the Cuyamonga Institute, our Q&A Conversation for Exploration series. I'm Paul Robert, the Executive Director and President of the Institute, and along with my wife, Laura Lee, the Director of Research, Education, and Outreach. And of course, on behalf of our Board of Directors, our advisors, our volunteers, and supporting members, we want to thank you for joining us today. The Cuyamonga Institute is an independent nonprofit research organization committed to researching consciousness and the human experience following the footsteps of our founder, anthropologist Dr. Felicitas Goodman. Our focus is reflected in three main areas: experience, education, and exploration. We respect the path of academic balance, the creative pursuit of science, while advancing, conserving, and restoring a direct experience of that deeper human connection to all of life. So it's part of our mission to expand our own experiential research with the multidisciplinary understanding that's available to us today. So as an educational institution, we're taking an open approach, and we created these Sunday discussions and invite scholars in related fields to help broaden the scope of our own work and exploration. And that's why we call this Conversation for Exploration. Today, we will address the human story from the perspective of warfare. Why has war been such a consistent presence throughout human history? It's a pretty straightforward question, but one that is extraordinarily complex to answer. In today's world, rapid advances in artificial intelligence is enabling a whole nother era of cyber warfare. And we all want to know, is there really a realistic path to global peace? As humans, if we really do need a challenge, a sustained but realistic effort to reduce war's likelihood and destructiveness would benefit humanity far more than sending a few more brave humans to some distant planet. So today we want to approach warfare from the perspective of anthropology.
Well, I'm glad to get the anthropological view on war, to gain insights so we can perhaps avoid it, and certainly better understand the psychological, the motivational, the worldview, economic, and cultural reasons for going to war. Also, I'm wondering two things. If you make it, you will use it. It's a very old adage, but it seems maybe that can apply also to nature. Nature designed men to defend the tribe, defend the homestead, defend culture, a way of life, philosophy, resources. So nature equips, as it does all animals, humans, with the capacities to do so. So does that mean that we fall into that mode because we can? Is it a go-to when it need not be? And is where we are with robots and artificial intelligence, as you mentioned, Paul, now making our technology ever more powerful and indeed out of our hands? Is this the inevitable next stage in our development with tools, technology, weapons, and using this technological prowess we're gifted with? Is it this inevitable arc in our journey, or did we take a wrong turn somewhere? Or look at the biological imperatives. The animal kingdom has many examples: competition, combat, war between individuals and whole groups. Even ants conduct warfare when they raid other colonies. I understand ants have soldiers and sentries that can program to sacrifice themselves, even defending as they need to. Well, we're pleased to welcome back Todd VanPool, along with his wife, Christine. They are both members of our advisory board. They're both professors of anthropology at the University of Missouri. Todd is a cognitive anthropologist. So among the many courses he teaches is the anthropology of war. We need to understand where we've been, who and what we are in the larger context to better navigate where we're going. Welcome back, Todd.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Are you ready for me to kind of get going here?
Well, first of all, tell us why this course?
We're your students. We just stepped into your classroom. What's the very first thing we need to know?
And why is this a course you chose to really dive deeply into?
So you asked some really worthwhile questions there, Laura. And the reason why we have to worry about warfare in terms of the anthropology of warfare is because it's one of the cultural universals. It is one of the things that every culture has a concept of war, and virtually every culture that every culture that we've looked at ethnographically, and almost every culture that we've looked at archaeologically, shows evidence of going to war at least sometimes. Now, some cultures are constantly at war. They exist in a state of war that's ongoing and does not stop in any meaningful way, whereas other cultures will have it once a generation, once every 25 years or thereabouts. But when you look around the world, warfare is one of those things that is present in every culture, in the sense of every culture is aware of it and has rules related to it and has the idea of it. And most cultures are involved in it on a fairly regular basis. As a result, it becomes a central issue for us to think about in terms of the development of culture. And I tell my students when they first come into the class, when we're talking about this, I'm going to actually advance to the next slide here. This is one of those places where I really love humans. It's one of the reasons why I became an archaeologist, an anthropologist. I find humans fascinating, and we're really cool. What we do is really neat. But there are these areas where we do some stuff that is not quite as neat as I wish it was, where there are bad things that can happen and do happen. And this is one of those topics. So I tell my students when we start talking about this, that the focus here is not in somehow glamorizing or justifying or condemning warfare. It's just that for people around the world through time, warfare has been a fact of life. In my own life, my father was a Korean vet and a Vietnam vet. He served in both of those theaters during active combat. And my son joined the military and served during the War on Terror. And I think a lot of us have situations where fathers, sons, uncles, brothers, or ourselves have been directly involved in warfare. It's simply a fact of life, even in our life, but even more so in the past. And so this is one of those things that really does matter. And I point out to my students that if I were writing a history of just a book on history or a history of culture, I could write the entire thing based only on warfare. But I could not write a book talking about history in a meaningful way that completely excludes warfare. When we think about it, technology, the social structures, and the events of the past, warfare is really one of the major things that has structured human life since we literally had the start of anatomically modern Homo sapiens and behaviorally modern Homo sapiens, I guess I really should say. But even before then, we see evidence of conflict between different groups. The upshot here is that it matters. I didn't start off my career studying warfare because I found it really interesting. Instead, through time, I wound up studying warfare because it was so important to the people I was studying and looking at. And as a result, I realized I had to learn more about it to be able to understand the humans I was studying. Does that answer your question, Laura?
Oh, indeed. Yes.
Yeah.
Cool. So, one of the things I also point out to my students is this concept of ethnocentrism. A lot of times we look at other people and we have a tendency to say, man, that just doesn't make sense. I don't like that those people do that, which I understand. We certainly should have our own sense of morality and our own ideas of what is right or wrong. But in terms of anthropology, we need to understand that culture is the way that people interact with their lives, the way that people structure their lives. And for folks within that culture, it makes sense. It makes as much sense how they organize their lives as the way that we organize our lives makes sense to us. So ethnocentrism is something we need to avoid in anthropological study. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't have morals. It just simply means when we're looking at other people, we can't impose our morals on them and say, what they're doing just doesn't make sense, or those people are irrational, or they're evil, or they're dumb, or they're somehow inferior. Because if we were amongst the Yanomamo or whatever, we'd be every bit as much Yanomamo as they are. If we were raised in Japan, we'd be every much a part of that culture as we are a part of our own culture. And so where we're raised, the culture we're raised in, it affects our behavior, it affects our morals. So ethnocentrism is one of the things we have to keep in mind here, even as we're talking about folks who are doing things that, from our perspective, are horrific. It's horrendous. It ought not to be done. It's morally wrong. Within their cultural framework, it isn't. And we need to understand that. And as a result, to really understand what's happening, what's going on, we have to step outside of our own cultural framework and think about it more broadly.
Agreed. Yeah.
Even if when we step outside of the cultural framework and just talk about our neighbors, when you starting out a sentence with those people, you've already set yourself up for something.
We can't understand other people if we just simply say they don't make sense.
Right.
That kind of stops the whole conversation moving forward.
Yeah.
So that also is true with warfare, because we have been raised with a particular style of warfare, and that sort of style of warfare is not what is necessarily common across culture. In fact, the style of warfare that we practice is rather unusual and not particularly common. So kind of going back to your question there, Laura, warfare is just simply a fact of culture, and anthropology as a result has a lot to say about it. Okay, so given that fact, and given the structure that anthropology is dealing with culture, and how it varies from place to place, time to time, and how people within different cultures view it, there's been a lot of different ways that people have thought about warfare, a lot of different meanings that people have given warfare. Sometimes it's glamorized, sometimes it's kind of condemned. But here are a couple of famous quotes from folks who have talked about warfare in a meaningful way. So here's one. Heraclitus of Ephesus: war is the king of everything. It makes people kings, makes others slaves. It sets them free or enslaves them. This is certainly true in the ancient world. Absolutely true. Here's another one. This is from a poem that I used to read when I was a kid. I suspect that Paul has read this a number of times. Horatius at the bridge. Then out spake brave Horatius, the captain of the gate. To every man upon this earth death comes sooner or late. How can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods?
Mm-hmm.
We also have things like this. So Jocko Wilkin is a very popular internet influencer personality. He's written a lot of books on leadership and has resonated with a lot of young men, where he's kind of talking about taking control of your life and applying some ideas about how to get yourself kind of checked out and moving forward with your life. But he was Navy SEAL and uses that insight to talk about how to motivate yourself and how to become a better man. Here's what he has to say. But war is also an incredible teacher, a brutal instructor. We learn lessons in war written in blood about sorrow, loss, and pain.
Yep.
Here's, of course, we just had a Patriot Day celebration here at the University of Missouri, and I'm sure that many other people have had them in your communities and whatnot. But Remembrance Day isn't just about war and those we've lost, but about the ideals and what we stand for. It's about respecting our past and looking hopefully forward. More than anything, thanking those who have served. So we see this, sometimes war is kind of being glamorized. Sometimes it's kind of being lamented here. Here's another example. If the thoughts and forces of humanity were not spent on war, we could put an end to poverty worldwide, which is kind of the point that you all were making at the start. It seems like we spend a whole lot of time doing war where we could be doing other things.
And maybe alleviate some of the reasons for war too.
Absolutely. And here's, this is, of course, a popular 60s song as well as a passage from the Bible. But there's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and time to die, time to plant and time to uproot, a time to kill and time to heal, time to tear down and time to build, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. From the diary of Anne Franks: till all mankind without exception undergoes a great change, wars will be waged. Everything that has been built up, cultivated, and grown will be cut down and disfigured to begin all over again after that.
Mm-hmm.
From the Psalms of King David: praise be the Lord, my rock, who trains my hands for war, my fingers for battle. He is my steadfast love and my fortress, my stronghold, my deliverer. He is my shield, in whom I take refuge, who subdues people under me. So there we go right back to the other side, where war is seen as a creative thing that leads to good things for people, for individuals. Of course, Albert Einstein, exact opposite side. I'm not only a pacifist, but a militant pacifist. I'm willing to fight for peace. Nothing will end war unless the people themselves refuse to go to war.
Yeah, militant.
And then probably the single most famous quote about war that I know of, at least in my life, it's been the most famous. In peace, sons bury their fathers. In war, fathers bury their sons.
Yeah.
So we get lots of different perspectives from individuals. Here's another one: not very good with death. Father was a military man. Military men live with death, live for death, live on death. To a professional soldier, oddly enough, death was life.
Yeah.
Here is from a soldier, Daniel Summers, who unfortunately committed suicide. I am left with basically nothing. Too trapped in war to be at peace, too damaged to be at war.
Ouch.
Of course, Winston Churchill, war is a game played with a smiling face, but do you think there's laughter in my heart? And then this is the last one, which kind of leads off into the rest of our discussion. And this is from Karl von Clausewitz, who is a famous philosopher of war, actually was one of the generals that Napoleon relied on, and he wrote a book that's been very influential in terms of Western military thinking. He's like the Western version of Sun Tzu with the art of war. He's kind of the Western version of that. War, therefore, is an act of violence to compel our opponent to fulfill our will. War is merely continuation of policy by other means. We see, therefore, that war is not merely a political act, but also a real political instrument, a continuation of political commerce, a carrying out of the same by other means.
Oh, wow.
And there, war is very transactional. We do it for a goal and for a purpose. Each of these views of war has been reflected cross-culturally, and each of these views of war is, for want of a better term, valid in the sense that people use them and approach war from these perspectives. So for some people, war is about loss. For other people, war is about glory or gain. For other people, war is utilitarian. It's what you do to accomplish the goals that you wish to accomplish. And in truth, war is each of those things. When we look at it cross-culturally, those insights are, in fact, very real. So here, when we're talking about this, I have a couple of goals here. I want to define what warfare is and differentiate it from other sorts of violence, and also explain why it's anthropologically important, giving you some examples.
Okay.
So kind of starting off with a definition, and then we'll talk about some useful questions that can give us some insights into humans and deal with what I call the problem of warfare, which kind of goes to the central thing of what is it that causes humans at a fundamental level to go to war. We're not talking about necessarily at a approximate level in terms of people go to war because of, the assassination of the Archduke or something like that, but rather what is it that makes war possible and has made it so ubiquitous in human history? So war, from an anthropological perspective, we use a definition that's not the same as other definitions, say in history or whatnot. So a lot of times people define war as conflict between state-level societies or something like that, which makes sense because those folks want to look at grand wars, World War I or World War II or something like that, as opposed to the famous Hatfield and McCoy feud here in Missouri. I don't know if people are familiar with the Hatfield and McCoy War, but it was a very big thing that happened here in Missouri. Two families got together and they actually waged, from an anthropological perspective, what we'd call war, with the two groups going after each other for quite a while, and it was a pretty big deal. Anthropologists are interested in that level of conflict as well, which a historian might see it as, a little kind of a vaguely interesting side story to history, but not central to history. For anthropologists, that style of warfare is also warfare and something we want to study because a whole lot of human violence is contained in that style of warfare. So from an anthropological perspective, war is actual or implied armed conflict between politically distinct groups. And a lot of times these are actually families. So the Hatfield and McCoy conflict, the feud between them, actually is a perfect example of warfare from an anthropological perspective. Even though there aren't grand armies and even though you don't have government one versus government two, you actually have groups of people who are fighting with each other in an organized way and a way that is based upon these political distinctions. And so when we're thinking about warfare, it can be something like a castle, and maybe a battle was never fought to that castle, but that castle was built defensively for war. It's a location where war was conducted, even if it was implied warfare, and that's the reason why the castle is there. So how do you understand the castle? Well, you understand the warfare that led to the castle being formed. Then we've got, groups outside of kind of our Western tradition, groups that may be comparatively small-scaled compared to, say, a big nation state of Rome or Babylon or the United States. So, for example, New Zealand, the haka, the dance that the New Zealanders would dance as part of warfare, that still resonates culturally with folks from New Zealand, and it's still a part of I don't know if you've seen them, but like before a rugby match, they'll do the haka dance and stuff, and it's intimidating. It's very impressive. But that is a reflection of this warfare, this tradition of warfare that was present amongst a smaller scale society. And so it would be not the right sort of a framework for anthropologists to say warfare is just something that happens amongst state level societies once you get state level societies. Instead, warfare is a part of most people's lives growing up human for the last 40,000 years. Warfare has at least been something that could happen, even if it wasn't happening at that moment.
Well, on such interesting scales, I mean, Shakespeare looked at that with Romeo and Juliet.
Absolutely.
Celebrated that in West Side Story.
Absolutely. And from an anthropological perspective, that's warfare. When we're talking about warfare, we include that. The Montagues, absolutely, that's a part of warfare. And of course, the Apache versus the U.S. Cavalry, another example of warfare, which, you know, a lot of times historians or political scientists might not consider that warfare. For us, that's part of what we're studying. So why do we care about it? Because it's so central. And growing up human, for the most part, men were involved in warfare, at least at some level. And for a great many cultures, if you were an adult male, you were also a warrior, in addition to whatever else you might be doing. It just simply has been central. And so you look cross-culturally and you see warfare reflected in the archaeological record time and time and time again. It can be anything from watchtowers at the borderlands between two groups of people to, you know, the weapons that people are being buried with. And sometimes we see, for example, in ancient Europe, young men who obviously never went to war are buried with swords and stuff because they were at least seen as potential warriors. And the idea of manhood is tied up with warfare. So even if you had somebody who was, let's say, had some sort of birth defect that would prevent them from actually being able to fight in war, or you've got somebody's young, a 6-year-old or 4-year-old who obviously never went to war, they would still be buried with weapons because that's what they were, at least potentially.
So was that also a status symbol or a proving of your manhood, like the Maasai warriors had to go kill a lion in order to go through their initiation rites or something like that?
Almost every culture, traditionally especially, but almost every culture has some sort of rite of passage in which the young man demonstrates his courage and demonstrates his capability frequently as a warrior. And so it can be, doesn't have to be against humans, although it can be against humans. But at the very least, there's a level of danger in there that establishes their ability to defend themselves and to protect the people that they're with.
Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So here I've just got some examples. You can see the tattoos here on the far right. Lots of folks will use tattoos to reflect their strength, their vitality, the history. In some ways, it becomes like medals or a rank that people wear. You earn more tattoos as you get older. So a lot of cultures will reflect that in their bodies. And then
Also like a mask. Doesn't it serve rather as a mask so you step into a certain identity culturally?
Yeah, absolutely. But sometimes it actually changes over the course of one's life as you gain prestige, status, and honor.
Like badges that you wear in your uniform. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Chris was just mentioning to me that the Mohawks would actually on their face mark the number of individuals that they had killed and the number of battles that they had been in, and these sorts of traditions are cross-culturally extremely common. But you know, the terracotta army in China, perhaps some people have seen that. That's a perfect example of, you know, this emphasis on warfare. The king dies and he takes his army with him, at least symbolically, as the terracotta army and whatnot. So
expected to be fended in the afterlife, I guess. Huh?
well, and yeah, so as you were saying, part of status as well. So yes, absolutely, absolutely. So when I teach this class, I ask my students at the very beginning of class to write down questions that they have, and I kind of compile those. Then at the end of class, I give them back the questions and we talk about them. And I ask them which questions were useful and which questions were not useful. And then we talk about the questions that were useful and the answers that we have for them now. It's a great way to kind of summarize where we've been, but also for them to realize, you know, kind of how they were thinking about warfare, how that's changed, and kind of to place it into a cohesive whole so that they can think about what they've learned over the course of the semester. So here are two extremely common questions that I get that my students at the end of the semester consistently say, we weren't asking the right questions. We weren't thinking about it in the right way to get the sorts of insights.
Those are my very questions too.
Well, but the thing is that these are the questions I think that people think about the most often. And so, yeah, not being critical of my students or you or anybody else. These are, you know, when my students say, hey, you know what, this isn't quite where we were trying to go here.
We need to get beyond these obvious questions. Yeah.
So one of the questions is war inevitable? And when I ask my students why they don't think it's a particularly useful question, they always come back with something like, it's like asking if murder is inevitable. Any single murder might be avoidable in the right circumstance, but I'm going to bet that in 100 years there's going to be somebody who's murdered. It just seems to be a part of the human condition. And they say that in the same way that even though any one war might be avoidable in some way, that they anticipate that there will be wars in the future. Just simply looking at the past and understanding where we're at in humans, that warfare is going to be a part of our history moving forward, just as it has been a part of our history in the back. And so they found that to be, ultimately an uninteresting question in the sense of they now kind of have the answer in the sense of it is a part of what humans do. And one of the things that one of my students I thought did a great job pointing out is he said it only takes one group to go to war. All you have to do is have one group, and you see this with Ukraine. Why is there a war between Russia and Ukraine? Because Russia invaded. It took only one group to really start that war.
I know, like Einstein said, all we have to do is refuse to go to war, where you can't really refuse when somebody else is deciding to attack you.
Exactly.
Your response is either acquiesce or defend yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's exactly right. And so, is there in the future going to be some ruler or some group that's going to want to go to war? Almost certainly. It's, so there we are. Then also, is war natural? And the reason why my students don't like this particular question is that as we're talking about it, they come to realize that humans are humans. And we got these incredible genes. We've got these really cool environments. You put our genes in our environment and voila, you've got the humans. What we do is natural in the sense of it's something that humans do.
We're part of the animal kingdom. Yeah.
Exactly. And humans consistently do certain things. And so it becomes kind of like is it natural? Well, humans keep on doing it, so I guess so. It becomes hard to distinguish between what would be natural versus unnatural. And so for them, they just find that by the end of it, they find that kind of a confusing question.
Right.
Just look at the animal kingdom, gives you plenty of examples of this. Yeah.
That we actually spent a couple of weeks talking about primates and aggression primates, and you're absolutely right, because what we do is very similar to what a lot of other primates do as well. We'll come back to that here in a moment or two. So these are the questions that my students find most useful. And so I thought that if you all wish, we can ask these questions. We can also ask any other questions that you all might want. And so Laura, Paul, or whoever, please pipe in here. I'd love to answer any questions you have. But these are the questions that my students say, that was a really useful question, and that's a useful question to think about. So what factors influence the structure and intensity of warfare? How does warfare structure other aspects of society? And what are the gender relationships reflected in warfare? And so they find these to be, things that really gave them some insights into humans and thinking about humans. So kind of starting with the first one. So our first question here is, what factors influence the structure and intensity of warfare? So warfare, as I said, seems to be a cultural universal. Every culture has a concept of warfare. And truth be known, on a somewhat regular basis, once a generation or thereabouts, people seem to go to war in almost every culture. Here are two factors that the cross-cultural analysis by Ember and Ember, their husband-wife team, really good anthropologists, but they went and they looked at 186 different cultures from around the world. And all these cultures, they excluded any cultures where there was, peace imposed upon it by a colonial power or something like that. So they're looking at traditional cultures that are kind of working in a way that has not been so heavily influenced by some sort of colonial power that things have completely shifted away from what had previously been going on here. Look at 186 of these cultures. They find that every single one of them has warfare, but that some of them have ongoing warfare where they're literally always at war. And then other cultures have very infrequent warfare where it's once a generation or it's simply implied, but they're actually not going out doing very much fighting, or perhaps where it's just, largely ceremonial. They looked at that and then they compared these different groups, trying to figure out what aspects of culture, what aspects of the natural environment corresponded to highly intense levels of warfare. They found two that really stuck out. These are the two that explained the greatest levels of variation between the different groups. One is the threat of natural disaster. So these are things like droughts that might be coming up, and not a current drought, but a threat of a drought in the future. Do we have an unpredictable environment where I don't know what we're going to have next year? We're going to have lots of food or not very much food? Don't know. That's what they're talking about, a threat of natural disaster. And then socialization for mistrust or fear of others. Are people being trained to talk with others and talk out problems? Or are they being trained to think of those folks over across the hill as the bad guys? We don't really talk with them. If those two things are present, then warfare is chronic or at least very common. So if you've got an unpredictable environment and you've got a culture of mistrust of others, there'll be high levels of violence and fighting and warfare between groups. Those things are not present, then the level of conflict is much lower.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens here when you think about this, I actually call this my Black Friday hypothesis. And this is, they don't use that term. I use this term to communicate to my students. But you think about Black Friday, and it wasn't as bad this year, but several years ago, there'd always be these big fights over Black Friday. Why are there these big fights, and people being trampled and all that stuff? One, because people didn't know if there were going to be the resources they needed when they got there. What am I going to be able to get that one TV for $69 or whatever it might be?
Right.
And people are not being nice to each other. They're seeing each other as competitors as opposed to folks that they can cooperate with. So what happens is that when you don't know if there's going to be enough and you're not working with other people, that's when you start fighting the most. That's when you start throwing punches to get ahead in the line. That's when people are most prone towards conflict and fighting with each other. Same thing is happening here. If you've got good times, cool, we can adjust to that. If you've got bad times, there's not enough, sucks, but we can adjust to that as well. But when you have the most trouble is when you don't know if it's going to be good times or bad times.
And a common example, of course, during the pandemic is all of a sudden the toilet paper thing, where everybody was hoarding toilet paper and the grocery stores had to have limitations and police it. And it's like, what is going on?
Exactly. An illness that doesn't even cause dysentery caused around on toilet paper because people were like, am I going to have toilet paper? Oh, everybody else is buying toilet paper. I better go buy toilet paper. I better make sure I buy a year's worth of toilet paper to make sure I got enough toilet paper. And exactly, it's that sort of thinking. The conflict is highest when you don't know if there are going to be resources.
Mm-hmm.
So Ember and Ember say, hey, if there's going to be really high levels of warfare, these two things are almost always present. Warfare goes down as one or both of these things go down, as people talk more with each other, or as resources are kind of level, and you either know you're not going to have the resources, or you know that you will have the resources.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, one thing I also point out here is that correlation is not equal causation. As a result, this is an argument from correlation. We probably will learn more as we continue to do our studies cross-culturally around the world. But this is all based on correlation. And so when we look at it, these were the factors that correlated most strongly to intense warfare. And so I keep that in mind as we approach this. So turning to our second question, how does warfare structure other aspects of society? For today, I thought I'd bring in two examples of this. The first is kind of how people organize themselves in terms of the relationship between households. And the second one kind of follows on that, but it looks more at how warfare leads to individual status, and as a result, the impact that can have on groups of people and their interaction. Mm-hmm. So when you look at societies worldwide, we see that there are patrilocal and matrilocal societies amongst traditional societies, and most societies fall into one of these two camps. There are some other societies that do things differently, but it's extremely common for societies to either be patrilocal or matrilocal. What patrilocal means is that when two people get married, the bride moves in with the groom's family. And so within the village, the males are related to each other. And you can have multiple families within there, but everybody's related to each other in general within a household. In a matrilineal society, and so what happens is that let me rephrase what I said there. Patrilocal societies, the bride moves in with the husband. The males within those households are related to each other. The females are from different households. So the females are not related to each other, but the males are related to each other. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Matrilocal societies. There, the groom moves into the bride's household. And as a result, all the women within the household are related to each other, but the men come from different households, frequently very different villages. So here we've got a patrilocal, reflection of a patrilocal society here. The A's, the B's, and the C's are all reflecting genetically related males. So these are males that are part of family A, part of family B, part of family C, or lineage, however you might wish to phrase it here. Within each of these villages, the circles reflect different villages. Everybody in one village is part of the exact same lineage group. And as a result, they rely on each other. Now, what happens when somebody from village B insults somebody from village C? Well, now you got a problem because somebody from village B insults somebody from village C, and so village C's father, uncle, son, or whatever is now ticked and goes over there to village B and starts a beef. And pretty soon you've got village A, village B, and village C all fighting with each other. When we look at patrilocal systems, there's almost always high levels of conflict between different villages. That's because guys start fighting with each other. And as a result, it's, hey, I got my wife here, and my wife's father, my father-in-law, is over there from that village B. But those folks in village B just insulted my son. And I'm not going to put up with that. And if I got to choose between my son and my father-in-law, I'm choosing my son. My wife might be angry if my father-in-law gets killed, but she'll get over it. I'm fighting for my son. My wife's right here next to me, and she's laughing. But the truth is that if I've got to go to war with somebody, I'd rather go to war with my wife's family than with my family. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Laura's shaking her head. Not
I
really.
don't know. I would just think that if you're related in a family, you would resolve it more easily. But I trust what you're saying. You're the anthropologist.
Well,
The dynamic did not
and-
quite make sense to me, but
and they actually do, but a lot of times what they actually do try to talk it out. A lot of times what we see is that in these sorts of societies, the women are actually viewed with suspicion because a lot of times there's a level of uncertainty about where the wife's loyalty lies. Does the wife's loyalty lie with me or with her
Oh.
old village? And so it actually creates lots of problems within the household. And in some villages, this can even be so profound that wives and husbands will share different rooms and different households, even in some cases.
So it breaks
And
them
so
up in a sense. Okay.
it creates high levels of conflict within family units. But as a general rule, if I want to go to war, I really want to go to war with the people that I grew up with, the people who are my kin.
That makes sense.
And that's how can we get the Hatfields and the McCoys fighting with each other, because I can rely on my family. Those other guys over there, they're the ones who hurt my family, and I'm going to go to war with them.
Okay.
So yeah, recognizing that different cultures deal with things differently. This is extremely common. Patrilocal societies in general have high levels of conflict between villages and between male kin groups.
I think you're giving us another good reason why women should rule the world. But
So here's a matrilocal system, though. About 20% of traditional societies are matrilocal. And so the remaining 10% are either what's called neolocal, where they'll just simply go to their own household. The bride and groom will simply set up a new household, or they're doing something completely different. But about 20% of societies are matrilocal. Here, the males move in with their wife's family. And as a result, each household has got males from different kin groups. Now we go to what you're talking about there, Laura, where, okay, somebody from village B insults my son. Well, I could go to war with them, but my uncle lives over there in village B. I don't want to go to war with them. Maybe we can talk this out. And so I'm happy, metaphorically speaking here, to kill my father-in-law. I really don't want to kill my son. I really don't want to kill my uncle. I don't want to kill my dad or brother. And because these individuals are scattered throughout all of these different villages, I don't really want to fight other villages.
oh, I see.
And as a result, with matrilineal groups, they don't fight amongst villages. They talk it out, like what you're saying, Laura. But here's the interesting thing. Some group from the outside attacks village B over there, and they hurt my son. They hurt my brother. They hurt my uncle. They hurt my dad. Now I'm ticked, and now I'm going to war with that village B. And so matrilocal systems are actually very interesting in the sense of there's low levels of conflict between villages within the same culture. But if you attack one of them, you've attacked every single village. They're able to mobilize, in terms of warfare, large groups to attack outside groups. So matrilineal systems are most common and are most effective militarily when you've got outside threats,
Oh,
because they
interesting.
band together
Less
very
so when
easily.
you have inside threats. And I thought that perhaps when women had a say culturally, and there were wise women councils, that they were less inclined to go to war because they're the ones that delivered all the babies and had to nurture them, and they have a lot more at stake with what it takes to get people onto the planet, right? So they're less inclined to risk them. That's how I always viewed it.
Yeah,
But this is another dynamic I'd never considered. So this is fascinating.
to kind of think about what you say there, Laura. Are women in the Ukraine more or less in favor of resisting the Russian invasion?
That's a whole different question.
Okay, my point here is that a lot of times anthropologically speaking, we see villages and people going to war, but it doesn't seem as if women are consistently anti-war and men are consistently pro-war. In fact, amongst some groups like the Yanomamo, we see women are very frequently involved in the warfare and are sometimes even, Chris used the term pushing it next to me. Yeah, sometimes they're actually instigating the conflicts that can lead to warfare. So I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying there. But what I'm saying is that when we look at cross-culturally, it doesn't come out to kind of a nice, neat sort of a packet of women anti-war,
Oh,
men pro-war.
never does.
And yeah, and I'm not
Things are
saying you're
not
saying
nice
that.
and neat. We're very messy. And
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right there, Laura. Absolutely right.
Well,
Okay,
I
so
think that there's waging war and then there's defending from war being waged
Mhm.
on you. So there's so many dynamics.
Yeah.
in this.
Yeah. It is, and each culture is, of course, complex and different, and it rarely comes down to single cause sorts of situations. But here's a case where the social structure both influences the type of warfare that's waged, but also in certain contexts, that sort of warfare can actually reflect the sort of structures that will develop out of the cultural system. And so one of the tasks I give my students to think about is, if there was a zombie apocalypse, how would people organize themselves?
Oh,
What they come
Oh.
down to is that the folks that are relying on agriculture and trying to build a new community are going to be matrilineal, and the folks who are wandering across the landscape raiding each other are going to be patrilineal, patrilocal. And
that
they're
makes-
probably right. Those things would actually probably develop along those same sorts of lines.
In both examples, however, I noticed you used men as an example of instigating conflict, or the ones going to war, even in the matriarchal or the matrilocal.
Yeah, matrilocal. Yep.
They're the ones that were responding to the slight. So I just wanted to put that out there, that by default, you're talking about male response, male aggression, instead of female aggressive responses.
When we look cross-culturally, women are very rarely directly involved in warfare. When they are directly involved in warfare, it either is with ranged weapons, or it's in a case of a city being overrun and it's the last-ditch effort, and everybody is fighting for survival. When we see cases where people, especially when people are using shock weapons, things like swords or spears or that sort of stuff, it's almost always men who are fighting other men. There's a very strong gender component. Now, there are occasional exceptions, Mulan being an example. But what makes Mulan so interesting is because it's such an exceptional case. As a general rule, women are not involved directly in warfare, except in the most extreme circumstances, or perhaps with bows in some situations. But even that is comparatively rare. So yes, you raise a very good point there. You raise a very good point.
So it really is the social construct, the matrilocal and the patrilocal, that can make all of the difference, because the instinct to war is common in both.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
The potential war is certainly there. Absolutely.
There's the biological element. I mean, testosterone, there's something there, right? I mean, you can't totally deny the fact that there's a difference there of what creates that energy, that fighting mentality.
I think Laura mentioned this at the very beginning, or maybe it was you, Paul. I don't remember. Doesn't really matter. But one of the things that we do at the very beginning of my class when we watch, when we're starting to talk about this, so we watch a film called The Five Species, and it's five species of different primates. And so it's got chimpanzees, it's got gorillas, it's got howler monkeys, and I forget the other species there. But going through it, and as you all pointed out, in each case, when there is something that threatens the group, it's the males who stay behind to the dominance displays and defend, whereas the females and the young are all running off to the trees or to some sort of safety. And that is consistent amongst all these primates. That also tends to be consistent amongst humans. Now, not always, not every human, but in general, when there is danger, it's far more likely to see males run towards the danger, whereas women and children will be more likely to withdraw from the danger. We see this, for example, with refugees and other groups. Again, it's not everybody, it's not 100%, it's not always, but as a general rule, looking through history, that is the case. When ancient Greek cities were putting out their armies, it was guys grabbing their shields and their spears going out.
Well, as they need to do.
Yeah.
There's an interesting study on the natural increase of testosterone simply by picking up a weapon. So that is a cue. The body goes, I need to generate more testosterone. So much involved in prepping you to perform adequately in that kind of emergency. And also, just men are just stronger. So I was trying to lift some boxes, and somebody was helping me, and I was like, oh my God. And he's like, oh yeah, this is like no problem here. And I'm like, Because, well, you realize that even the least strong male is stronger than 90% of women. I'm like, oh, well, it's just a biological fact, isn't it? This nature has equipped us for different tasks in a culture. Look at the animal kingdom once again. So there you go. I mean, yeah, biological imperatives also play into this. So
Thank you, Isabel, for your good input, good questions and
did
comments.
Amazons exist in your opinion, or are they just?
So there are a couple of cases where there might have been groups of elite female warriors. Libya is a case where these groups existed. They were never long-lasting traditions, and they were never the core of armies. So I'm not taking away from, you take an extremely fit woman, you give her lots of training, and she can be absolutely deadly with a sword or a staff or whatever. But as you pointed out, if you take a male, train them the same way, on average, the male will have certain capabilities, being stronger and whatnot, height advantages, reach advantages, these other sorts of things that on average over time means that most armies have consistently been male focused, male dominated.
There's that, physical warfare, but also the mental part of it. I mean, if you're to offend me, my wife is the one that's the warrior princess that's going to go at you. So some women have the ability to be strong in a different way. They may not come
Yes.
at you and punch you in the face, but they might punch you in a different way.
We have different
Absolutely.
styles, don't we?
Yeah. Yeah.
And when we
All
look
right.
across culturally, we actually do see different styles, different approaches towards aggression, because both men and women deal with aggression, deal with status and status conflicts. But a lot of times, cross-culturally speaking, and again, not everywhere, not every single person, not every single
Right,
time,
right.
cross-culturally speaking, men are far more likely to go and punch each other in the nose.
Okay.
Well, I pity the man that runs away from danger along with the women, right? That's
Yeah.
just not a good look.
Yeah.
I also, Paul and I have attended some beautiful Native American ceremonies here in the Pacific Northwest, where they men have stood up in a totem pole ceremony and said, it is our sacred duty to defend the tribe and the land, and we must do so in an ecological manner. And so look at all the threats to a safe village, to a
Mhm.
happy village. We
Right.
need to defend the ecological sacredness of the land as well as the integrity of the culture.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, how
Absolutely.
lovely to take that. Our sacred duty is to defend the tribe and apply that in an ecological sense. So,
Mhm.
I haven't looked at the statistics most recently, but my recollection is that for a while, and I think this is probably still the case, the Apache had the highest per capita contribution to the U.S. military because of the warrior tradition and the whole idea of defending one's land, defending one's people. And I've met a number of Apache who have been Marines or in other branches of the service. They absolutely do value that. Not just the Apache, across the
the
Pueblos, the
Navajo
Southwest, and
Packers. Yeah,
absolutely.
we've met a couple of those gentlemen.
The,
So,
the code talkers, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So long, very strong traditional warrior cultures within a lot of these Native American communities. Absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
thank
Okay.
you for your question.
So next example, kind of showing the impact in terms of cultural structure and social organization, is the Yanomamo. The Yanomamo, this is an example of folks where there is high levels of warfare, chronic. They're always at war with somebody. And this is one of those cases where it's patrilineal and they're fighting other Yanomamo. So the Yanomamo are not fighting some other group over the hill. Rather, when the Yanomamo are fighting, they have been historically been fighting other members of their same culture. So it's one village versus another village here. So the Yanomamo at the time that we're talking about here had about 25,000 people in about 200 or more villages. Boys were absolutely socialized for warfare. It was anticipated that they would be involved in violence. It was anticipated that they'd be involved in warfare. And it was just simply a part of life. When we looked at the genealogical studies, about 30% of adult males were violently killed. 44% of males had participated in killing. And about 7% of the folks had lost a close genetic relative, an uncle, a father, a son, to violence. So this is a case, I mean, I point this out to my students, do you think you live in a violent society? And a lot of them say yes. Some of them say no, but a lot of them say yes. Then I ask them, have 30% of the adult males that you've known been killed in violence? And like, good heavens, no. I mean, that's such an astronomical rate that we can't even conceive of 3 out of every 10 males being killed in warfare. But that's
the male female percentages. How does
oh
it?
yeah, far more females compared to males. The number of females is much higher than the number of males. Absolutely. Yeah. And so, there was one of our colleagues here, Napoleon Chagnon, went and spent some time working with the Yanomamo. And he was looking at interpersonal violence, homicide rates and warfare, these other sorts of things. And what he found was that basically the warfare and violence was a way for males to increase their status, to protect their families, and to create social alliances. So his argument for why there was such high levels of warfare was because of this need for males to establish status and this need for males to show that they can defend what is theirs. And so he's seeing it really as a focus on establishing individual male worth as what's going on here. And so in his mind and his argument, males wage war because they individually benefit from it. Now, this is one of those kind of sunken cost kind of issues there of if you died, you got the wrong end of the stick. But if you live, then you get the benefit. And so it's an all or nothing sort of a bet. You die, well, then you got nothing. But if you live, then you get the reward. And enough people live, enough people get the reward that it becomes the winning strategy. So raids were the most common form of warfare. With a raid, these villages are about they're a considerable walk away from each other, and so you have to walk over to them. It's not like you can just go there out in the afternoon and then come back for that evening. Instead, you're talking about multiple day efforts to get to a particular village. When people would do a raid, they'd go out as a group of men. They would lay an ambush. They would either kidnap women and children if they came across them, or if they came across the male, they'd kill the male. And so it's a tit for tat sort of a warfare where you kill one of ours, we kill one of yours, you kill one of ours, constantly ongoing all the time.
So, question on this one.
Sure.
So looking at the benefit statement for a
Mhm.
society set up like this, killing women and children, that reminds me of the male lion that wants to mate with this female, but he'll go
Mhm.
kill any cubs that she has because he wants his genes he wants all her attention to be on his genes and his progeny. Is there some kind of a hidden biological imperative involved in this?
So a lot of times, okay, let me come back to your question here in a moment. Let me come back. That's a good question. We'll come back to it in a moment because it is a good question. I got a
The
slide
other
that will deal
question
with
would
it.
be, you have so many women now, is that putting out a, what do they call it when there's more women aligned to one male? What do they call that?
Polygamy or
Polygamy.
potentially a harem, depending on how you want to phrase it.
Set it up because all these women need to be attached to some male for their protection, for the family, da da da. I don't know.
Absolutely. So here, let me show you exactly the way you're talking about here. The Yanomamo have a ceremony that they call unakai, and unakai is how you get rid of the spirit, the haunting spirit of the person you killed. So they go through this purification ceremony to get rid of that spirit. And men who've gone through that spirit are called unakai. They have gone through that ceremony, which shows that they have killed an enemy. Co-unakais are men who have killed the same individual. And so again, remember, this is hunting from ambush. And so you can have a situation where two people shoot somebody with an arrow and kill them. And so they both have to go through the unakai ceremony together. They become co-unakai. So just thinking about unakai, here is information that Napoleon has, the Chagnon collected. And here he's got unakai versus non-unakai. You'll see that the unakai have on average more offspring and more wives. And so the N there is referring to the number of men within that category, then the average number of offspring. I don't have the wives here, but the more offspring you have, the more wives you have, or you can use the number of offspring to correspond to the number of wives. So men who have killed in warfare get more wives and they have more offspring. And you can see that consistently, by somebody who's over the age of 40, on average, the unakai have got 7 kids, whereas men who have not been involved in killing an enemy have only about 4 kids on average. So it really does impact over the course of one's lifetime, one's status, the number of wives, and the number of children that an individual has.
You've been able to spread around the village, yeah.
Absolutely. And then when you have co-unakai, those folks, you can kind of think of it as a band of brothers. Co-unakai become very, very close to each other, even if they're not related to each other. In fact, the Yanomamo like going on these raids with people who are not their direct kin, so that they can actually form these co-unakai relationships. Because once you've killed with each other, you have this special bond. The special bond causes people to move in with each other into the same village. It causes them to share mating partners. So, I'll marry my daughter, please, and I'll marry your daughter. It creates this very close relationship. And the villages actually form around these co-unakai relationships. Those become the head leaders. They allow people to rely on folks who are not just their kin, but also these other folks within the village. So it corresponds to village leadership and the ability to have social power outside of just simply my little group here, my little family.
Facing death, that's going to create fighting
Absolutely.
together. So is this an adrenaline high, this fight or flight? I mean, this is also, you're in constant vigilance. You're in constant fear. There's danger around you. There's just no peace and settling, I would imagine, in such a culture. How does that change a culture? How does that change biochemistry?
According to Chagnon's analysis here in this particular case, someone who's an unakai actually has to worry less about those sorts of things because they've shown their ability, they've shown their capability. And so people are far less likely to pick a fight with them. They're far less likely to try to steal wives from them. They're far less likely to try to in any way take advantage of them because these individuals already have shown the capability of being able to kill.
That's
So
good for those people who climb the ladder in this way. But also this reminds me of the military might and kingship, right? You become a leader because you've proven your prowess and your strength and your ability to defend. So it's a little bit of that kind of social status climbing as well, isn't it?
absolutely, absolutely. And when we look cross-culturally, it matters to people when there is a constant threat of warfare. And in cases where there is a constant threat of warfare, so a society like Yanomamo, women especially will actually invest in making sure their kids are training for war and know how to fight and have the capabilities that will allow them to be a good warrior. And so they're actively encouraging them to be good warriors and pushing them towards being capable, because that's how those kids live longer. And so we do see, in societies where warfare is common, when people know that there is warfare, people actively invest and encourage, trying to get their kids to be great and effective warriors.
Yep.
Can I ask another question? Or because you just confused me, I'm sorry.
Sure.
Because when you said they live longer, but yet I'm looking at the total number of non-unikai and number of unikai, the non-number is larger.
Yes, but the Unukai have more kids, and that's what Chagnon was saying thereafter. And so it's not that they're living longer. If you die in warfare, then you've lost the bet. But the idea is you're a young man seeking to establish yourself. How do you do that? This is in a rainforest where there's literally the same resources every single direction you go. It's exactly the same resources. So they're not fighting over resources. At least they're not fighting over natural resources. It's not like they're fighting over a gold mine or the iron ore or something like that. Instead, they're fighting over something. What then Chagnon says, they're fighting over social status. That this becomes the way by which, if you're successful warfare, you elevate your status within your culture. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they live longer on average, but they have more kids on average, those who do live. So it's all or nothing bet. If you win big. You get the prizes. You get to be the leader of the village. You get more wives. You get, in this case, 43 children from 11 wives. Wow. That's, in this particular cultural context, that's hitting the jackpot. Whereas if you are known to be a coward or known as a coward, rather, instead you're going to have guys always picking on you. They're always trying to steal your wives. They're not treating you right, and you're always losing resources.
Wives aren't going to go and want to hook up with you.
Exactly. You're not going to be an attractive mate to anybody. You're not going to be an attractive partner to anybody. You're going to be shunned within the village.
This
And
is
so
interesting that you said that this resources in the rainforest are the same everywhere you go. So it's not about resources,
exactly.
but status becomes the commodity that is sought. And so this environment supports that kind of social structure. What is a generalized statement you can say connecting the environment to the organization of a culture around warfare?
So one of the things that we know is the men are in competition with other men in terms of being able to establish themselves and attract wives and do all that sort of stuff. And so men will show themselves to be powerful in different ways. In some cultures, you might be a great hunter. And so we see this, for example, in some maritime cultures, people go out hunting whales when there are lots of other things they could eat that are a lot less dangerous and that actually provide a higher reward for the amount of effort and whatnot. But they go after the whale because it's a whale. And if I can bring in a whale, I've shown that I'm capable and I can do good things. And exactly, Paul was doing the chest thumping thing. Exactly. Why do guys strap on helmets and hit each other on the football field? Part of that is to show that they're capable of being able to do physically hard and physically demanding activities. Chagnon's argument here is effectively the same, that this is one of the ways, cross-culturally speaking, we see men establish themselves as true men, as people of respect.
Well, compare that to, okay, in the Pacific Northwest here, that the potlatch is another way to show status. I've done good for my tribe, I've accumulated all these goods. Now my status is going to be to give them away. That's another way to provide for my tribe. I can go out and kill a whale that's going to provide meat for all the tribe, but I can also have this big festival and do the big giveaway, that status accruing. So that's a very good way in a peaceful society to provide without going to war.
And people actually talk about, I've heard people refer to the potlatch as economic warfare in the sense of there's competition there and they're fighting with each other and it's very intense in terms of trying to establish that I am better than you or I'm more powerful than you. And so it's not good enough just simply to have a good potlatch. It has to be the best potlatch anybody ever saw, sort of a situation.
Okay. So we just have competition naturally built into us, just like we have cooperation. So that's this give and take constantly, just like
That's actually
everything else.
Chagnon's argument in a nutshell. And he says in this particular case, it takes the form of warfare.
Okay, so the universe is all about order and chaos and this dance between them. And here we have expressing that in human nature. So
Yeah.
that makes sense. Okay.
So here, let's go back to the question that you had, Laura, about children and women in warfare. And so, what are the gender relationships reflected in warfare? And so we're dealing now with the third question that we had here, and this is the question that you actually asked a little bit ago, Laura. And I said we'd come back to it. Okay, so there was a great study in another cross-cultural study looking at a whole bunch of different cultures around the world. And so this particular case, the author looked at 44 different cultures. And he's asking questions about what happens to people in the context of warfare, especially the folks who can't fight. These could be men who are knocked unconscious or otherwise debilitated out on the field of battle. It could also be captured women, captured children. So you asked, hey, captured women, are they killing the kids because that would allow them to have more kids with the mother, and potentially have the mother have more interest in the kids or whatnot? We actually see variation in this, and so this analysis asks those basic sorts of questions. And so here we have 44 societies, and the individual Otterbein is his name. Otterbein divided these different groups based upon the way that they organize themselves politically. What he found is that there are 8 societies in which if you are part of an enemy group, you are killed once they get a hold of you. Doesn't matter if you're a woman, doesn't matter if you're a child, doesn't matter if you're a soldier, doesn't matter if you're an old man, doesn't matter if you're a baby. If you're part of that other group, you're killed. There are 8 out of these 44 where if you're an enemy, you're simply killed. But what that means is that there are 36 in which you aren't necessarily killed. At least some people some of the time are allowed to live in these particular cases. And so none of these are kind of our state level modern societies. We're talking about traditional societies as opposed to the United States. We're instead talking about, one of the examples of the Yanomamo that this Otterbein was looking at here. So in cases where you've got a despotic state or a chiefdom, yeah, you're as likely to be killed there as not in terms of if you're going to be every enemy killed or not. But when we go away from that, so tribes with feuding, that'd be like the Yanomamo, or band level societies where you got small groups who are fighting with each other, tribes without feuding in mature states, you're far less likely to have everybody killed. Instead, at least some people are going to be spared at least some of the time.
Mm-hmm. But what about if you're a hereditary chieftain? You are going to be killed, and so are your progeny because they want to end your lineage and impose their own.
Exactly. And so the despotic state or the chiefdoms are the ones who are most likely to kill the enemy because they're at least relying on terror. You're trying to eliminate your competition. Yeah. And that's when you kill all enemy when you get a hold of them. Whereas with the other sorts of frameworks, you might in fact bring people in. And so there's a great book called Captives and Cousins that talks about the Southwestern Native Americans and on up into the plains, those Native Americans, and talks about how within those cultures, they really were kind of concerned about maintaining population levels, but also there was just sort of this kind of humanitarian ethos that was present. And so when a woman or a child was captured, they weren't necessarily killed. Now they might be killed, but they weren't necessarily killed. They'd become captives, and eventually they'd actually be adopted into the group, become a member of that group, and just simply be, this is my wife or this is my son, even though genetically it's related to somebody else.
Isn't there a benefit to bringing in other genes and adding to the gene pool, just like there would be in animal populations? It's healthy.
Absolutely. And the Iroquois is another example where if you lost somebody in battle, what you ideally wanted to do was to go and capture an enemy alive to replace that individual, because you wanted to maintain the community.
Basil, I can go get basil.
Yeah, Chris was saying here, next to me, because she's here in the same room with me. She was like, if we lost a son, our goal would be to go get another son to replace the son we lost. And so there are Native American groups that are kind of primed towards that sort of a framework, and it's extremely
capture a pioneer. There's lots of historical accounts of that, and if they've survived being adopted into the tribe, they become a full member. Yeah.
And that's the key, is you just said they're adopted into the tribe. You actually become a member of the tribe, a member of the group there. Whereas with a despotic state or a chiefdom, you don't get that sort of a thing. Instead, those are rival groups, and you exist and continue by eliminating those individuals.
What I found so interesting is some of those accounts of pioneers being captured and adopted, they didn't want to go back to the white society. They preferred their native society.
Because that's what they were at that point. They were part of that community. And so, you know, it's like I'm here as part of this community. Just let me be here as part of this community. These are my people.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's an extreme form of adoption, I guess. But so it's not slavery. It's taking someone and being a captive, and then over time they become part of the tribe. They become an equal member. They're not a lower member or whatever. They're part of it. That's just fascinating.
They've proven themselves. And,
Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, it really would be, as Chris was just saying here next to me, it'd be like substitute basil becomes basil. He really does become that
I
part
see.
of the community. So
Interesting. All right.
now when we're yeah,
he inherits everything you have.
Mhm.
Chris is saying that I don't know if you can hear her or not, but she was saying that actually he would then really be he would inherit the status and the titles and all the other stuff
Wow.
that go along with it, and so literally would become that position, that person.
Mm.
Now, when we're looking at captive warriors, it really is a bad place to be as a male who's been captured by the enemy. You're more likely than not to be killed. So here, yes means you will be killed. No means that sometimes you might be allowed to live. So we kind of switched the meaning here, but yes means you will be killed. And 28 of the 42 societies where we had data for this particular comparison killed all captured warriors, sometimes quite brutally and sometimes in the most painful ways you can imagine.
Ouch.
But if you're a captive warrior, chances are pretty good you're going to be killed. And sometimes when they're not killed, they're being either held as slaves or they're being held for ransom or something like that.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, women and children, are they sometimes spared? A yes here means that sometimes they're spared. A no means that they're never spared. So here we see cases where, again, women and children are far more likely to be spared compared to captured warriors. A lot of times they'll be adopted into the group, but a lot of times they'll either be held as slaves, sometimes sold to other groups as slaves, or they will be held for ransom or something like that. But a lot of times they will actually become a part of your group. The Sabine women are, if you're familiar with ancient Roman history lore, the Sabine women were a case where Rome killed the Sabine, captured the women, they became the wives of the Romans. We do, in fact, see that cross-culturally. It's not just simply one story in ancient Rome, but rather we do see those sorts of strategies where people go on raids for the purpose of capturing marriage partners.
Inspired the movie.
It
Yeah.
did. The Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, one of my favorites growing up. It's one of those that I'm not sure it aged quite as well as I got older and really kind of understood what was going on, but it was a fun movie when I was 12 or 13.
Yeah.
And so, you know, here he breaks down a little bit differently, centralized versus uncentralized. Uncentralized are far more likely to let people live. The centralized communities are more likely to kill everybody because of the centralized government. So cool. Does that answer your question, Laura? And because you were asking, you know, do you get situations where people kill women or children or other warriors and whatnot? And the answer is, yeah, we do get cases, but the women, a lot of times, they'll actually hold on to the children. If they're going to capture the women, a lot of times they'll actually also capture her children and treat the children as part of the group. Depends on the culture, though.
I would imagine it's pretty easy to enculturate a child who's very young into your tribe. That's just what they're going to know growing up.
Absolutely.
You want to
Absolutely.
expand your numbers, so there's practical reasons for these decisions.
Absolutely, because that young child can become the warrior that helps save your village in the next war. So
Maybe you
absolutely.
couldn't trust another soldier you captured because he's going to try to escape or kill you or whatever. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Even in the modern era, we would draft teenagers to 19 years old. We don't draft 50-year-olds who have their own thoughts about how things should be done. So we don't want your opinion. We're going to get the 19-year-olds. We can train them.
But speaking as a father of a 19-year-old who did exactly that, you're right.
Yeah.
So this is I think, Paul, you had mentioned the the fact that we've got conflict amongst other primates, and we've got the sort of chimpanzee and the gorillas and other groups where, and actually I think Laura also, you mentioned this as well.
Right. Laura,
The sort of patterns we see amongst humans are not inherently unique to us in the sense of we don't see anything else at all like it amongst other primates. Humans obviously can organize themselves in different ways. We can use technology. Primates couldn't launch World War I and World War II, obviously, but we do see what would be considered warfare amongst chimpanzees and some other primates as well. And so let's take a moment and kind of look at that. And so current evidence supports the hypothesis that selection has favored a hunt and kill propensity in chimpanzees and humans. That coalitionary killing has a long history in the evolution of both species. So this term here, coalitionary killing, is very significant because this is the key to talking about the problem of warfare and what's going on here. Because when you think about it, warfare doesn't make sense. If I go to war, even if it's over status, why not? Why don't I compete for status in some way that doesn't necessarily lead to my death?
Thank
I
you.
could potentially do that. I mean, going for a whale is dangerous, but at least the whale doesn't have a spear trying to kill me. There are other ways I could establish status as opposed to just simply warfare. So when we think about the issues of warfare, we come down to kind of an issue of why do it at all? There's some serious disadvantages to going to war. And so coalitionary killing, anthropologically speaking, is part of the key to answering why people actually are involved in warfare, even though if we look at it just simply from a logical analysis sort of a framework, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So when we think about coalitionary killing here, fighting with other humans is a dangerous activity. And I've got an example here from the MMA fights. If any of you have seen the MMA fights, it's amazing that guys will get in there, get into the ring and fight with each other. But they do consistently. And there's a lot of money. It's a big sport. But my point here is it's also dangerous. People truly get injured with these sorts of sports. And there have unfortunately been cases where people have been killed doing this sort of stuff. And
Really?
that's just simply a sport. It's hard and it's dangerous and it's violent. What we see instead is high levels of coalitionary killing when we look across the animal world. Coalitionary killing is where you don't have a fair fight. In fact, it's the exact opposite of a fair fight. So if you look at the bottom here, the bottom picture, this is a group of chimpanzees. You've got an older chimpanzee who is a very strong chimpanzee. This is early in the fight. You got these three young upstarts. These three young upstarts have gotten tired of the older, stronger chimpanzee pushing them around. They've decided to do something about it. And so they've attacked him. And by the time this is all done, the older chimpanzee is dead. And the younger chimpanzee, the leader of the younger chimpanzee, that coalition there, is actually pulling down a tree branch there to attack the older chimpanzee with. And so I'm sorry to kind of show this, but this is early in the fight, and hopefully it's not too unpleasant. The upshot here, though, is that any one of those three young chimpanzees is not fighting the older chimpanzee because they know they're going to get their claw cleaned. They know it's going to be dangerous, and they know there's a high potential of injury. Instead, what happens is the three of them gang up on the older chimpanzee, and they all walk away with the older chimpanzee dead and none of them injured. And that's coalitionary killing.
Well,
And
that's the same with animals even deciding, am I going to go after a big cat will carefully analyze, am I going to go try to take down this? What is the risk? They're injured, they're dead.
Right.
So we need to look at the chances that we have of surviving an attack too. That's carefully part of the equation.
Sure.
Exactly. It cost benefit equation. Whatever I get out of this, is it worth potentially getting hurt? And if I can do something like get my two buddies to come in here and help me, then my cost benefit analysis has changed drastically.
Way up, and I've got allies.
Absolutely. And so, you know, we see chimpanzees using the same sort of logic, and humans will also use the same sort of a logic. For us, it just sort of seems like common sense. But, you know, if I'm going to get into a big fight, I kind of like to have the folks around me, like my brother, my father, my uncle, all those folks around me that I can really rely on to help me do well.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What interests me too also though are insects that go to war. I mean, even the socialization of an ant colony can mobilize to go attack another colony. I mean,
Absolutely.
on that level of insects, it's, oh my God.
Wolves will also follow a similar logic.
Mhm.
You mentioned lions and the prides will follow similar sorts of logic. So this is not a logic that is unique to humans. In fact, we see this reflected in all primate species. We also see this reflected in other members of the animal kingdom. And so
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. This is actually, you know, kind of a logical way to think through the cost benefit analysis for animals. And they
Mhm.
sit there and they decide, is this worth the fight or not?
Yeah,
And the
Kind of an
coalitionary killing becomes a
evolutionary
part of that.
construct
I see.
across species.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So one solution that we have for this is that if you have coalitionary killings, you get more land. And more land leads to more resources. More resources leads to more kids and better health for your kids. And so it's been evolutionally selected for. The argument there is. And so the argument is that humans are involved in coalitionary killing, which warfare is just simply a large form of coalitionary killing. Coalitionary killing is the basis of warfare. And so the argument here is that humans are involved in warfare because we're involved in coalitionary killing.
Got
We
it.
form coalitions, which become our political units, which go to war with each other. And at its core, it's really coalitionary killing that leads to warfare. If you had enough chimps and the chimps could organize themselves, they'd go to war too. The only reason
Because
why
they
they don't
don't
go to
want
war,
the cost benefit and they go, okay, it's worth it. That you can see that across the board.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Planet of the
absolutely.
Apes.
I hear that females are the prize, greater access to females. I
Well,
mean,
and that can be one thing, but you know, the argument here is it could be more resources of whatever sort. And so it might
Right.
be females, could be bananas, it could be whatever it might be, whatever it is that is in
Toilet
some way
paper.
limiting your evolutionary potential. So the argument here, though, is that with increased fitness, you get more resources, and this leads to this sort of a framework where these critters are looking for imbalance of power and intercommunity dominance drives, where what they say is that you'll engage in violence when you think you can win, and what you really want to do is dominate the communities around you so you can get resources as you need them and even take it away from them so that you're the biggest group on the block. Does that make sense?
I have
And
to ask a off the beat question.
sure.
So, I mean, really, you're saying not in all cases, but females are the prize. Females are the prize because then you get more of your progeny, and biology has built in, hey, we want to really create the next generation. That's just built into species across the board. We really are driven to continue our species. So to me, it's like, well, why are women vested with original sin? Why are we the ones that have to be bound up and become chattel, become property, right? Why are we the ones that need to be controlled? Is this just part of it? Or why are we blamed for so much? I mean, the Trojan War, it was all about, oh, the temptation of one young man to run off and marry some, I mean,
Yeah, Paris and Helen and all that,
yeah.
you know, the fall of Troy that comes from that.
Yes, why are, I mean, it just seems all bound up in how women are treated through society and how our status and the control of women, et cetera, et cetera. It
It's
just
more of
seems
a comment than it is a question. Yeah.
Sure. And you know, there are lots of reasons why people go to war. There's no doubt that cases like the Trojan War with Helen and Paris and whatnot, that is a reoccurring theme. But people also go to war for lots of reasons that don't
understood.
boil down. I guess what I'm saying here is that culturally, what people fight for sometimes can be as straightforward as honor. You came into our land and now we have to kill you because you
I
did
also
do
think
these sorts
that's
of things.
still a gender war because men want status to impress the female. Men
Mhm.
want
That's
to provide for the tribe, which is providing for the females so they can make more babies, right? I mean, it
mhm.
really just comes down, a lot of it in various ways to that dynamic of our biological imperative to continue the species.
I think
Exactly.
it's true that men typically go to war for the community, which is actually seen for as the females within the community.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I
you're
think
also saying that it's many reasons, such as the acquisition of property, of land, pride. There's so many reasons why it would come out. But yeah, Laura's one is a significant part of that picture. For sure.
absolutely. And Laura's got a good insight there.
Well, look at the bowerbird that wants to go around and make this beautiful nest to attract the female and collects things to put into it and bedazzle her and shiny objects. I mean, it's just that same drive. Try to get a mate,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
Pass your genes along.
All right. Yeah.
So thinking about this coalitionary killing and actually tying into what you're saying there, Laura, one of the things is that hypothesis I've just presented, which we thought actually solved the issue, doesn't really solve the issue. We've realized that more recently. That doesn't solve the issue. And the reason is because what happens when you have these groups fighting with each other, they'll form boundaries. And then they'll work hard to stay away from those boundary zones, because if you get close to those boundary zones, you get killed.
Yeah.
And so what happens is that people, but not just people, other primates, other wolves and other things will actually wind up using the core 35% of their territory the most, and only venture into the other 65% of their territory on occasion.
Wow.
And the upshot here is, wouldn't it be a whole lot better to not fight and use your entire territory as opposed to fight? And so the whole idea of the community dominance hypothesis and expanding your territory is that you get a bigger chunk of land, a bigger chunk of resources. But what we actually see is that the conflict between the communities decreases the actual land that's being used intensively and decreases the resources that are available. So it actually does the exact opposite of what we were thinking it did, at least when people were, making these hypotheses and suggesting them. Instead, what we see, and this goes directly to the heart of what you were talking about there, Laura, is that there seems to be a difference in terms of how critters are using the landscape. So you see bonobos there, and bonobos do fight with each other. There was a while there where they're called the peaceful chimpanzees and stuff. Bonobos actually do fight with each other. They're entirely capable of these sorts of coalitionary killings, entirely capable of it.
But it looks like they do so less.
They do so less because they actually move around in groups. So one group of bonobos comes up to another group of bonobos. It's pretty much a fair fight. And so instead of fighting with each other, they actually get along with each other. In comparison, chimpanzees, because of what they eat and the environment they're in, you can't have large groups of chimpanzees wandering around together. They don't get enough food. And so chimpanzees are lone foragers.
Environment, here's another case where the environment affects the social organization.
Exactly. And so the chimpanzees are lone foragers. They go out. If one chimpanzee encounters another chimpanzee from another troop, they'll sit there, they'll yell at each other, and they'll do dominance displays, and they'll do the whole chest thumping, and maybe one of them will chase the other one off, but they actually rarely fight because it's too dangerous for each of them.
Right.
But if you get 3 chimpanzees from one troop who encounter a lone chimpanzee from another troop, unfortunately, that's a dead chimpanzee. They're going to attack because they have the numbers on their side, coalitionary killing. So when we actually look at this in terms of chimpanzees, but not just chimpanzees, we actually see this across the animal kingdom. We see coalitionary killing most common when you have lone foragers or small groups where you can get these sorts of imbalances, where you've got large numbers on one side and small numbers on the other side. And that's when coalitionary killing seems to be most intensive. What that suggests then is, for humans, we were somewhat like chimpanzees, where we had coalitionary killings, at least frequently enough and in context enough, where coalitionary killings could actually be beneficial and humans would be involved in these sorts of coalitionary killings. And the suggestion there is that the way that we approach conflict involves a sort of coalitionary killing strategy within our heads, that we think about it this way, which is why if I go to YouTube and I type in fight, I'll probably come up with a dozen fights of 12 people all standing around beating one guy on the ground. That would be very consistent with what we see amongst chimpanzees and whatnot. The upshot is that is, as of right now, our best explanation for warfare. Why is it that humans fight? Because we got this sort of logic in our head. This sort of logic in our head is reflected at lots of different scales. It's reflected on the schoolyard, when you get groups of boys beating up another group of boys, or for that matter, groups of women beating up another group of women or another single female, but we also see it even at larger scales.
Does this also explain why bullies are bullies? This
Yes.
just explains, you mentioned the schoolyard, and that's really this whole thing acted out, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why bullies are, they got to have their audience. They got to have their audience. It's
Wow.
dominance displays. Absolutely.
Hmm.
Come on,
Wow.
they have their minions.
What did Chris
So
say?
she said, and that's why they have their minions, the little mini bullies that follow them around and all that other stuff. It's all part of this coalitionary formation.
Wow.
So that's kind of what I had to say, and I can end it there. You know, I know we covered a lot, so I'm happy to answer any questions, especially if there's something that was unclear that I said that might have
Well, I
confused
was so
somebody.
curious as to what the anthropology of war would be, what it consists of, and it's rather fascinating. It explains so much about human dynamics and social structure and all the various reasons. That was just fascinating.
Yeah, my students are always surprised by the whole matrilineal, matrilocal, patrilineal, patrilocal thing, because it's like, oh, how you organize your communities really affects the way of whether you're fighting with your neighbor next door or whether you're fighting with those folks clear over the other valley. It really does.
And what are the factors that go into organizing society? Why do they exist the way that they do?
Absolutely.
So, yeah. Open up to questions, because I'm sure there are going to be some interesting ones.
Yeah, and Isabel, if I did not answer your question fully, please let me know, because I'll be happy to
Yeah.
answer it if I didn't quite get there.
You did eventually address the second question. Thank you. Yeah.
Excellent,
Yeah.
excellent.
Yeah.
I mean, got the answer to the
Mhm.
question I was trying to articulate. Yeah.
Any
Yeah.
further observations or questions, Isabel?
Yeah, and if Christine wants to make any further comments, because she's too far away from the microphone, she'd have to come join you
Yes,
at the
let's
same
put
screen.
Christina
But
on. Yes.
Christine always has really,
She's being bashful right now.
spot on.
That's
Okay,
so rare.
that's good.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, for me, it's even when you proposed this topic, when we first discussed it, it's been something that is challenging because, we all have this world that we live in, and especially participating in this institute, participating in the work of Goodman, looking at the anthropology of consciousness, and that we somehow have this idea that maybe by raising consciousness we can resolve the conflict, and that's true. I think there is something to do with that element of it. However, when we look also at the historical aspect, indigenous aspect, ancestral aspect, when we look at the full spectrum, it's ingrained in us. And it might be a pipe dream somewhat to ever think of world peace when we think that is China and Russia and the United States, and are we all going to Israel, and are we ever going to get to the point and the level of humanity that world peace is accessible on any level? Or will this particular aspect to our genetics or whatever it is within us, that maybe we can calm down some of that? And in fact, I read one article prior to today's discussion by a married couple anthropologist who did some research, and they were saying over the last 200 years, within the indigenous cultures, there's very little evidence of the continuation of that. There's been that it's come down of the warfare that we think of, that we're talking about today, and popular culture, that's not necessarily true. It's still consistent. But over my lifetime, whether we go, you talked about Vietnam and prior to that, and the Gulf War, and there is big gaps, and maybe less so than in historical evidence. I don't know, but I'm still wondering. I guess I'm asking about 5 questions so far, but I'm still wondering. Is there a path forward that we can even have that dream of world peace, and if not so, at least can we subside some of the conflict, like in my introduction where I said that the amount of expense and energy going to moving to another planet, starting a new culture and colonizing Mars. We're going to bring all this energy with us. This isn't going away. So it's sort of like, you live in a house that's totally messy. You go buy a new house, it's still going to be totally messy because you haven't learned how not to be messy.
Right?
You're bringing that technology with you. You're bringing that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I don't know if you can even address, because that's such a broad question, but I think we all have to think about that. And those of us that think that we're on a path of consciousness research, that we're on a path of evolution, that we're on a path of through mindfulness and through ritual postures and through all these different practices and yoga and all, we're trying to calm down that particular aspect that causes war within us. And that's a good thing. And but where does that take us next? And in terms of the entire general population of the world, are we making baby steps towards a universal change in the world's consciousness that at some point in time down the road that humanity does find a way to, you can't erase it, but at least cut back, resolve some of that.
So to answer your question, I know that you got the mirror effect here. This
Yeah.
actually says war, what is it good for? And I put the title in the does it look perfect? Okay, for me it looks like it's backwards. Okay. This book is the book I use as my textbook when I teach this class. And he actually deals with the question you asked there, Paul. You asked a number of questions, and this is one of the best places to look for it. There's another book by Pinker called The Nature of Our Better Angels, I think is what it's called, or The Better Angels of Our Nature, the better angels of our nature.
Right.
Both of them correctly, I think, point out that the likelihood of warfare affecting any one individual has actually decreased drastically through time. And so we think that we're involved in lots of warfare. And if I put up every single major conflict that occurred in the 20th century, from the Boxer Rebellion clear on down to, the World War I, World War II, all this other stuff, clear on down to the War on Terror, there looks like there's a whole lot of warfare. But the fact is that the likelihood of any individual dying in warfare is much lower now than it was, say, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago,
A lot more people on the
2,000 years
planet now.
ago.
Mhm.
The argument there that both Pinker and Morris make is that part of what's going on here is we've got these very large governments that are seeking to monopolize force. So what happens is if I go and I try to shoot my next door neighbor because now we're having a Hatfield McCoy sort of situation. Somebody comes and says, knock it off, you're going to jail, stop it, it ends now.
Right.
And so the argument here is that even though the nations will fight with each other, and the death toll of those nations fighting with each other can be tremendous, the fact is that they limit warfare within their boundaries. And that overall decreases the number of people who are being killed in warfare per capita. Now, that's not saying that the actual, the death toll of World War II was tremendous. But in the past, if all those folks had been organized like the Yanomamo out across the landscape, there would be an even higher death toll than what happened with World War II.
30% of the, yeah.
Precisely. And so the argument there is that the rise of these large governments, so the United States, Russia, and so on, and, that you can have bad governments. Ian Morris actually talks about this as the Hitler paradox. You can have bad governments, Mao Zedong, Hitler, Stalin, who are killing their own citizens. But Morris's point is that those governments tend to be unstable and they tend not to last very long. That through time, what happens, in fact, are governments that are somewhat stable, that at least have some level of law within their boundaries, and that prevents a lot of warfare. His argument then from that is that, Paul, going to what you were asking about, their solutions is for some form of government that maintains peace. If you really want to reduce warfare, have a government that says you can't engage in warfare.
Use trade, use
trade, use whatever. But, and I think that was the impetus that was underlying the initial formation of the UN. Was the hope was that we could create, not necessarily a world government, but an organization that could lead to
an agreement among all nations about what are
exactly
the goals of engagement.
And we can have arguments about whether the UN has been a net benefit or a net negative. But I think it is true that we have a lot lower level of warfare within the boundaries of the United States with the United States than if we didn't have the United States.
Two questions on that then.
Right.
Number one is, how does the threat of a nuclear war, I mean, you've got to have a lot of motivation to push a button and engage in a nuclear war. And I'm hopeful we don't get to that stage. The second question would be, Bucky Fuller looked at the equal distribution of resources, living versus weaponry, and looking at trying to invent tomorrow's solutions today to give everybody enough, right? We can feed everybody if it's just an equitable distribution of all of this. But that's not even the most important reason to go to war. As you pointed out, there's many other motivations. So I'm not sure now that even that would solve all of our issues around war for a future.
Mhm.
So I'm kind of wondering, what would it take if we can imagine that we can all communicate now globally? We're trading globally. It's to the world's and everybody's benefit not to go to war. How do we get to that stage?
Right.
So you asked two very interesting questions. I'm going to deal with the first one first. And you mentioned the idea of global war and nuclear war and these sorts of things. There's a really interesting, I'm trying to find the citation if I can for y'all. There's a really interesting argument that one of my colleagues has made. I'm trying to remember his name and I can't remember it off. Doesn't matter. I'll see if I can find it and I'll put it in the chat if I can. But basically, he argued that the level of political complexity corresponds to the technology for warfare. So the argument is that you can't have a Roman Empire if you don't have the right sort of technology. If you're simply relying on handheld clubs, the Roman Empire could never exist. You need the Roman gladius and you need the Roman, you need all the things that go along with the Roman army to be able to get Rome. And by the same token, the argument is you couldn't have a nation like the United States if you didn't have firearms. If everybody was simply armed with a sword or a spear, you simply couldn't hold it together because you have to have the ability to project that level of force. Underlying that is the hypothesis that political complexity requires the application of force to keep people in line, at least in some way. Then when somebody says, I'm sick and tired of this, I'm going off. You've got to have somebody who can show up.
Yeah.
Got to have somebody who can show up with a gun, a spear, or whatever it is to keep them in line. You look at the Civil War, and he says that exactly proves his point. That was a case where if you didn't have those sorts of weapons, there would not be a United States. Going with nuclear weapons, then, the argument is that allows larger clusters of nations to form. And as a result, his suggestion is that eventually we'll see a world government, a single one unified world government develop out of these sorts of things. And when that happens, then possibly there might not be nation on nation warfare. But there's also this lower level warfare. So even though I said the United States doesn't have high levels of warfare within its boundaries, we do have some levels of warfare. We have, for example, amongst different gangs as they fight with each other. Mexico, for example, when we were working in Mexico, we encountered the narco wars that the various narco syndicates, the cartels had with each other. And that, from an anthropological perspective, is a form of warfare. It's not nation on nation warfare, but it is cartel versus cartel. And that style of warfare is probably going to be endemic to humans. There's probably not going to be much that we're going to be able to do to eliminate it for all time everywhere. It will always have to be tapped down. But the argument is that if you've got the right tools, which would be tools of violence, you can, in fact, punish the wrongdoers in a way that will help prevent or at least tap down that sort of warfare. Not arguing whether it's good or bad. I'm just simply saying that that's his argument there. And I do think he has a point about how the technology actually bleeds into that. And as you have stronger governments, you have decrease in warfare within the systems.
The escalation of tools of war. So we had to develop a nuclear bomb before the enemy did. So once somebody is capable of doing something, they're going to do it. And then there's this constant escalation. You see that in nature as well, right? You see that, yeah.
Absolutely. And there's no doubt about it. Whoever, we see this with the Ukrainian war, the Russian-Ukrainian war, how the drones have completely revolutionized warfare there. And the current strategists in the United States military are looking at updating our military doctrine and our military frameworks as a result of that. You know, the whole idea of large tank battalions moving across the landscape may be a thing of the past. Instead, these sorts of integrated combat units that are capable of defending against multiple threats may be the way we go.
Wait till they
Um,
unleash AI and the robots into warfare, then watch out, right? It's just, that's just, yeah. But also,
Having seen Skynet and the Terminator movies, I'm with you there.
yeah, yeah. But I mean, look at nature. So the hawk has sharper vision to go see the hare on the ground. The hare has better camouflage and he's going to run faster. And there's just, it's part of the propelling of evolution, I think also, right?
Mhm.
We need to get better to escape our enemies or to at least feed ourselves. That escalation. So it's just interesting how nature's playing out amongst this weird species that we are, isn't it?
It really is interesting. We are fascinating, and I love humans. Even the bad sides of humans are very interesting.
Isabel has a follow-up question, and so I brought her back on. Go ahead, Isabel.
Well, this is turning from macro into the instigation again. And I had some questions in the chat, and I apologize for taking up this time.
Well, no, you're great.
But
Apologize.
I don't know if this is true or not about Shaka Zulu changing the whole warfare in the African area where he was, where it was mostly demonstrative, when the tribes fought and he instigated actually going in for the kill. And then the response, so I'm curious about the response of his own tribe. Yeah, they got a lot of resources from it, but does it, and it seems to be that it just takes one sociopathic
Yeah.
personality to completely change a culture into supporting a more aggressive, violent manner of being in this world, which is just horrific.
Agreed.
You raise a really interesting point there. So when we look at a lot of different traditional societies, a lot of times warfare is largely ceremonial. Now, that's not to say that people don't die, but there's a ceremony to it. So an example of this is the Dani from Papua New Guinea. And there's a great movie called Dead Birds about Dani warfare. But the Dani are always at war. And what happens is you'll have one cluster of villages, another cluster of villages. They'll go out to a border zone and they'll throw spears at each other or shoot arrows at each other. They use both the hand throw spears and the arrows. And it frankly is a really deadly game of dodgeball. And they play right up until somebody gets seriously hurt. Then when somebody's seriously hurt, they're done. They go home. It's not an attempt to take over land. It's not an attempt to kill everybody. It actually maintains that boundary. So there's this boundary zone that you don't go into except to fight. And then you go there and they'll fight. And when one group has killed another group, there's a lack, or one group has killed a member of another group. There's a lack of balance. And that soul of the murdered individual, the killed individual, is crying out for vengeance. And so you have to go then and go kill a member of the other group in order to bring back the balance. But then, of course, they have to go kill one of your group because now, and so it creates this tit for tat, and that's what it's called, tit for tat warfare. It creates this tit for tat warfare. You kill one of ours, we kill one of yours. You kill one of ours, we kill one of yours. This ongoing cycle of violence. But the point there is that they're not trying to destroy the other village. In fact, they wouldn't destroy the other village cluster, even if they could. So if somebody came in, they said, here are a bunch of machine guns, you can go and kill all those folks. They'd say, why in the world would we want to do that? That's not what this is about.
Want to continue the
This-
dance, and we need a partner for this continual.
Right. It's all about balance. It's about maintaining that border, but they're not trying to kill everybody. And they would say, what sort of sociopath are you? You're exactly right. That then when you get into a different situation where somebody changes the rules, those groups are caught by surprise because they're playing by one set of rules, and suddenly now somebody is killing a whole lot of people and doing things in a brand new way. And it leads to high levels of initial success because of the changed rules, but also leads to a lot more people dying in warfare. Because now you're playing a different game. You're dealing with a lot higher levels of casualties. When the Native Americans, especially the Iroquois, got firearms, it changed warfare in a similar manner, where before it was largely ceremonial. In fact, sometimes only one member of each group, the war captain, would come out, fight each other. But then when the firearms came up, the shields that the Iroquois and other groups were using were no longer an effective defense, and suddenly casualties skyrocketed, and that just suddenly changed the entire structure because simply it was too easy to kill people. And as a result, the death rate changed, and as a result, the nature of warfare changed away from largely a performative game to a much more serious situation.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question, Isabel? Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Isabel.
Or
No,
factor,
good.
you know, why is it that in Rome, there was, to satiate the mob and the populace, there was this gladiators going out, killing one another, killing the lion, killing the, what they just wanted to witness killings. That, what you just described reminds me, what is this need for gore? Why
So
do we have all the disaster movies or the fight movies or the killing, the murder? Why is that so popular for us to witness nowadays, a little safer in film, right?
yeah, it's a culturally specific thing, and there are different levels of it. So while we enjoy MMA, there are actual rules in place to prevent people from being excessive injuries from occurring. And so you can watch MMA, but you can't see them using brass knuckles, for example. You don't see them wielding swords and stuff. There's lots of cultural variation. It is true that a lot of times, I mean, sports is something that we see cross-culturally. People love sports. They love people rolling stones along the ground and trying to shoot them with arrows. They love lacrosse and throwing balls around. They love running and wrestling.
Or the
And
javelin throw in the Olympics, right?
absolutely.
Kind of a substitution for the warrior on the field. But what is it that urge is being satisfied with these games?
So I'm not a specialist in anthropology of games, so I'm going to
Yeah.
give you what I know, but I'm sure that if you talk to the right person, they could give you a much deeper understanding than what I can give you. But the games, one, for the folks who are participating in it, becomes a great way for them to show their prowess. And so one of the things we see is that the games provide, especially young males who are seeking to establish status, a means of establishing status. And so, like killing the whale, going and getting into a boxing match or a wrestling match, or shooting my bow and hitting this target or whatever it is, becomes a way where I can distinguish myself.
And a way to get fit and to show strength and to develop the body and honor the body and its capacities, right? But the
So
gore
that is for sure a part of it. But also communities will use the games as a way to compete with each other for status. And so, for example, in Mesoamerica, there's the Mesoamerican ball game. That ball game was played for entertainment and for sport. But it also was a great way for elites to compete with each other as they fielded teams and as communities metaphorically fought with each other. Chris, would you like to actually talk about that? That's more of your area.
Oh, it's already 1 o'clock. maybe
Oh,
another time.
Okay. Chris says if you want to talk about the Mesoamerican ball game, she could come back, but it's probably not enough time to be able to really talk
Oh,
about
I
it
would
right
love
now.
that,
But
Chris. That would be fascinating.
yeah,
We should do that.
but the upshot is that it probably transcends just simply the individuals, and communities become involved in it. So, you know, the Kansas City Chiefs, which are really close to us here, boy, people love them. And we're all really glad because the Mizzou Tigers, who are ranked number 6, just beat the Boston University, another ranked team, yesterday. And I wasn't involved in it. I didn't have anybody out on I was related to out on the field,
Yeah.
but we're still all happy that we won because it's still our victory that we all share. So
Yeah,
that
there's a
community
shared
bonding is part
victory.
of it.
So
Exactly.
war
It's community bonding.
and some of these games have a correlate. It seems like games can be a safe place to play out some of these natural
Mhm.
imperatives towards war games. But
Yeah.
death, I mean, I
Yeah.
know, Chris, that in the Mesoamerican games, the loser was killed, right? So this was a game to the death.
It
Death
wouldn't have to be the
changes.
winner or the loser. It was at the discretion of the elite. And so the elite may decide that no, the winners are the losers. And so it was subject to the
I
elite.
see.
And so it's just kind of complicated.
So
Yeah.
sometimes it's like
God.
wrestling where
trying to say is death really changes things. Death, how we handle death and how we mitigate death and the existential questions around death really changes the game and makes
Right.
it much more serious and somber and
Right.
and we just have to bring our all just to deal with it. I mean,
Yeah.
death was one of the basis for religion, right? What's the afterlife? Big questions around death,
Mhm.
war and death. I mean, just big, big, big.
Yeah, absolutely.
At the
Any kind
core
of
of human culture, right?
Mhm.
Trying to deal with it all. And then cannibalism. It was always curious to me why cannibalism was found at Chaco Canyon and even in the Americas among these Pueblo, very peaceful, beautiful communities. And I think you said this was a group coming in and terrorizing people. It wasn't just natural to the culture, but it was an outside force coming in and saying, now we're really going to scare you and intimidate you. So
We see different reasons for cannibalism, and sometimes it can be the Donner Party style of cannibalism of, while we're really hungry and this is a food source that's available. Sometimes it can actually be respectful. And so amongst certain groups, you eat your honored dead so that they're a part of you. They always remain a part of you. But you're absolutely right. Cannibalism absolutely can be used as a way to terrorize folk, which is why with genocides, true genocides, we very frequently see cannibalism as a part of the genocide.
Yeah.
It is a part of it. Because with that act, you're saying not only are we destroying you, not only are we destroying everything you can be or that you are, we're also consuming you completely, such that there's nothing outside of us that is you.
Right.
And it is unfortunately, talking about the dark sides of humans, that is one of the dark side of humans that we do see.
So this completes our University of Missouri presentation on Todd, you always bring such fascinating and incredible discussions. You're very articulate and you do your homework, your research. And so you and Christine together, what a powerful duel. And I'm so appreciative of you, how much you've shared with us and how you support us and how you encourage us to go forward in the research that we do with Dr. Goodman's findings and all of that. So what an honor. And leaving off from the last part of the discussion, talking about games. I mean, this is a Sunday. This country has an obsession with football, with sports. Stadiums will be filled with 60, 70 and more thousand people. And then national television, millions of people. There's something about it. Today we don't have 70,000 people listening to this conversation, even though what we're providing to you is something so far more important. But then again, there's something about human nature that needs that outlet of aggression, of watching something. And like you said, people say, oh, my team won. You didn't play the game. You didn't coach the game. You didn't even attend it. You watched it on TV. But you're eating your popcorn and you're watching the game and your adrenaline goes up and yeah, we did it. So there's something about that we just can't dismiss that's within human nature, which comes back to the very first part of our conversation, anthropology of war. There's something within us. And, what a spectrum of information you've provided, because even when we booked it, I was still like, how does this all fit in and how do we understand it in the spectrum of what we consider to be consciousness research and what we're doing as an institute? And it fits in perfectly. It educates us in a way that we cannot live in denial of our own human nature and how we have to integrate ourselves in a more powerful way to resolve some of that inner angst, that inner drive to dominate, that inner drive to be a warrior, I guess, as I
I
should
would
say.
also say that there's a lot more to say about this. I'd like to continue the conversation. I'd like to invite Chris also to weigh in because you mentioned games. Well, in my mind, games are also about being on the winning side. And you want to be on the winning side in a warfare. There's some status to that. There's some opiate in the brain, satisfaction to there. There's survival instincts there. There's so much about competition and also, are the gods favoring us? Every warrior appeals, I think, to some higher force. Let me win. Let me be on the winning side. Let me do my job. Let me be part of the conquest for whatever purposes.
One of the things that my vet students always talk about is the warfare magic they have. You carry your lucky coin, you carry your picture of your family, you do something. You say your prayer before you go into battle or whatever. And so my vets always talk about the warfare related magic, for want of a better term. That's what we would call it anthropologically. And I don't mean that in, you know, a
I think
dismissive way.
games are like that as well. You know, let's roll the dice. Will it show that the gods are on our side? Do they favor us?
Yeah.
That's a big thing. Are we in
Right.
harmony with our environment, right? Are we engaged on the right side? But also, I appreciate that you started out with quotes from the Greeks to the Romans to Einstein to Churchill, the Western perspective, or what became the Western perspective of our current civilization. But then you went into the tribal dynamics, which are even sitting at the core of us. That we've spent more time being hunter-gatherers in indigenous societies by a large factor than we have in our current civilization. So we need to look at all of us, all of humanity, all of the larger context to really understand it. And you dissected that so thoroughly. So thank you. I mean, I come away with a lot more questions, but a lot greater depth of understanding about this constant engagement we have in war, competition, and cooperation. Cooperation is also part of that in coalitions and looking at nation states. And I'm really curious how AI and robotics and who's going to be the winning side on that is going to change things. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm just a little bit terrified here
Uh-huh.
and
Mhm.
just hoping that we can engage it also for, I mean, I think with all the existential threats that we have, I'm hoping that humanity will come to the conclusion that we better lay down arms and we better all pull together for the survival of any of us in
Mhm.
facing what the future is going to bring. And maybe that will be that outside threat of, if we don't get it together, we're all doomed. Maybe
Mm.
that will be the final turning point. I'm hoping. But
Yeah.
thank you so much for all the work that both you and Christine do. And we look forward to more interviews. You two
Yeah.
have been the most interviewed.
I sure appreciate you letting me come on. And you mentioned the AI stuff. Ian Morris suggests that actually that the AI and the computer and the sort of emphasis on the mental integration of the world can actually lead to decreased warfare in the future. But I think it's an open question how it's going to play out. I think it's a very open question. And I frankly have no answers because this is a new technology that we're still trying to get a handle on, even the capabilities of this technology. We don't even know what it's capable of yet,
Well,
let
and
alone how it might impact things.
And who's
even in
gonna-
a recent interview with Bill Gates, he doesn't know. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, so yeah, no one expects it. I mean, this is way growing at a pace that outpaces even the people that are leading the technology revolution. So,
Absolutely.
all
Too many
right.
Dr. X's here, isn't it, too?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you,
Thank you
Paul.
so much, Todd
Thank you, Todd. And Chris. Thank you, Christine.
and Chris, of course.